We are so honored to have you join us for this episode of Beyond the Loss. I'm Aditi Leverage, and I am a bereaved parent to two and parent to one living child. I'm a specialized pregnancy and infant loss coach, mindfulness meditation teacher, and founder of the registered charity, the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center.
And I'm Danyelle Kluski, bereaved parent to my daughter Emelina and parent to two living daughters. Co-founder and director of operations of the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center. On this show, we share real stories about parenting and healing through pregnancy and infant loss. We allow space for the often silenced truths around loss to be heard. We offer an affirmative space for all people impacted by loss to share their stories, their triumphs, and their healing.
Please keep in mind that the stories shared are personal stories and are not to be used in replacement of professional advice. Should you need additional support, please visit our website in the show notes that are linked.
We are so excited to have you join us for today's episode. Let's start talking.
Hi everyone and welcome to Beyond the Loss. Today we are joined by Rebecca Foshole-Luke, who is a forensic social worker who works with parents and guardians providing advocacy, education, and support as they navigate the child welfare legal system. Rebecca uses her life experiences, education, and passion for social justice to inform the work she does with families. Through her work, she hopes to push for anti-oppressive, anti-racist policy and organizational changes that will ensure parents and children have more equitable supports and resources to keep their families together. In her spare time, Rebecca loves spending time with her husband and busy toddler, taking naps, cooking for her friends and family, and exploring the Calgary food scene. She hopes that by sharing her story and experience with pregnancy loss, it will allow for more openness to talk about pregnancy loss and create more spaces for support for women and families. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. We are so happy to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, and I've personally known you for, goodness now, what is it, like 8-9 years?
I think longer, because I've known Vic for 8 years, and I met you before Vic.
Yes, you did.
I was
yes,
seeing
you did.
Vic for, I think it's more like maybe 10 years.
10 years. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I've known you for 10 years. And it's been I was actually, fun fact for our listeners, I was Rebecca's doula for her pregnancy with her now toddler.
Yes.
And it's just been such an honor, Rebecca, to just witness your family growing and you as a social worker growing and just you as a human just stepping into your power. It's been such an honor to witness that. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to be on your podcast for the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center, which you founded. So it's been awesome seeing your journey as well, too.
Oh, thank you so much. Today's a special day for you. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your journey and the significance of coming on this day in particular?
Yeah, so today is my baby Malachi. Well, it was supposed to be his due date. So I experienced a miscarriage last year, August 17th. And so, I just thought it would be a way to kind of honor him. I was 8 weeks pregnant when I experienced my loss. And, at that time I had told a lot of people, I told a lot of family and friends and things like that. So, when it happened, obviously I had a lot of support, but it was also still quite overwhelming. And given, I used to serve on the board for the Loss Center when I was starting, and just being friends with you, I was very well informed about miscarriages and loss. So, you would think that in terms of how I would kind of deal with it, you're kind of more prepared than, if there's some people who just never imagine that miscarriages could happen. And I actually remember, I think when you were my doula, I think that's when you were like, 1 in 4 women, experience miscarriages, and it's super common. So that was kind of interesting with my experience, and for it to happen so early, like at 8 weeks, because we were actively trying. So, peeing on the sticks and things like that. And I know a lot of women don't find out till much later. So yeah, that's why today is a special day. And I decided to name Malachi, even though, I never actually got to find out the sex of the baby. And actually, I lost him. It was like a Monday, and the following Wednesday, we were supposed to do the dating ultrasound. So I wasn't even able to like see an image, or hear a heartbeat, as well too.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like this conversation is so important for a multitude of reasons, but I really feel like there isn't a lot of conversation around really those impacts that we have as birthing individuals when we lose a pregnancy, quote unquote, early, right? Because you didn't get to see Malachi on ultrasound and all of that, how did you actually navigate like the early loss and how it was impacting you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still figuring that out now.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even though it happened so early, the physical aspect of the loss is very like real. And, you still have flashbacks, right? And where I say, sometimes I gaslight myself because I'm like, sometimes it seems like I wasn't pregnant, right? Because I've never felt kicks, never saw ultrasound, never heard a heartbeat. It wasn't even 12 weeks, right? So you kind of like are almost like, was I really pregnant? Because you don't have like kind of, I guess, some of those tangible things to hold on to, right? Of experiences. But then that raw feeling of like the physical aspect of losing your baby, where for me, when I was so scared to get my first period after my loss, just being like, this is going to be triggering AF. I don't know if I can cuss on here, but this is going to be so
you
triggering.
You can cuss on here. You can
cuss. Like, this is triggering as fuck. So I think, yeah, that's the shock. I think just those two extremes where you're like, yeah, like, and I didn't have any sickness, any symptoms or anything, right? So it was almost like, okay, but then the physical aspect of remembering seeing, your baby bleeding out of you, and that is something that's never going to go away, has been a huge adjustment and a process. And, I know there were some people who say something like, well, maybe that's why you're not supposed to say anything so early on. And because I had told so many people, I started to be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have like said anything. But then again, I'm almost like, then that's, people wouldn't know. Like he wouldn't be real. It would just have been like me and Vic and my immediate family just like knowing, right? And then again, there were some people who were like, oh, well, at least it wasn't like, your baby was born stillbirth or something, to kind of say the pain is less because like, I don't know, there were still cells. There was no, which was also hard. And I would kind of say to myself, like, okay, yeah, if I had heard a heartbeat or if I was like 20 plus weeks or something, would that have been much harder? And I had within the last year, I had a cousin who had twins, and she lost twins at 20 weeks back home. And then my sister-in-law also lost a baby around 20 weeks. So, I think that's a thing where I went through this thing of feeling like invalidating almost my grief, because I was like, oh wow, these people would have like, were so much farther along, and mine was just 8 weeks and I didn't have an attachment. But then, like when I did my Instagram post today, I'm like, I just feel this love for this 8-week-old baby that I never even met. And why is that, right? Like where, you dream about what could have been and who they were and what they were like and all these things. And that gives meaning to my grief, even though it wasn't 8 weeks. And I do think more people who I think people don't share as much if it's that early, because some people are like, is that even a baby? Like, it's still, is it it's an embryo, right? I think, is it an embryo first and a fetus, or vice versa?
Yeah, yeah,
like to the
definition.
scientific definitions, right? So,
Yeah. Well, and I
yeah.
think that's the thing, right? We kind of, when it's early loss, that's what we do, is we kind of gaslight ourselves, right? Like, well, was it real? What, like, maybe I'm overreacting. We find ourselves, like searching for like the medical definition of what it was to validate ourselves. But at the end of the day, like you said, like the Malachi was real, right? And your heart felt that. And that's all that we need that's all that we need in order to acknowledge that this grief, no matter at what stage of pregnancy loss it is real. And I really thank you for coming on and talking about it, because it is true. We see this, we call it like the competition within the community even, right? We see it a lot as people who've had early loss kind of, well, at least it wasn't, further along, and then they kind of diminish their own experience. But as Danyelle has said, right, grief is grief. And it doesn't matter at what stage.
I think we use the statement, at least it doesn't, in grief, and it's like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And when we talk and we're like, well, at least it wasn't further along. I firmly believe when we pee on that stick, we are already imagining our lives, and we're already planning that future. So I have not had an early loss. I had a stillbirth, but if I had an early loss or a stillbirth, I was still already, as soon as I got that positive test, I was planning summer vacations. I was planning, what my maternity leave would look like. I was planning it all and making decisions, because that's who I am. And I know I'm not the only person that dreams about that future. So I feel like an early loss, you're still grieving that child, you're grieving those dreams. And the added trauma of having to experience pieces of, the loss, so that bleeding, that physical piece of a miscarriage. I personally have never experienced it, but just in what you were saying, it was like, I was thinking, like, I could not imagine that being a trigger for the rest of my life. And I know that for some individuals, some birthing individuals, that is what happens every single month until that period stops. So thank you for sharing that, because again, like, I've never experienced early miscarriage, but just hearing your story makes me really think, wow, like there's a piece of trauma that we have been keeping quiet for centuries that should never have been kept quiet.
No, thanks for that, Danielle. Like, makes me feel seen. Makes me feel seen, and I mean, I think you shared it. I think you say that because this is pretty graphic, but anyways, I swear I saw my baby like out, like, like obviously there were parts, but I was just like, yeah, I know he's, super tiny, and that is horrifying. And it's so horrific. And, people don't realize. And I was telling my husband, I'm like, yeah, I'm literally sitting here just bleeding him out. I didn't have like intense cramps. And that's the thing. I guess you imagine all these, like, what a miscarriage will be like. But for me, it was not super heavy bleeding. It wasn't like these like intense cramps. So, but I think another interesting thing that I just thought of is kind of the medical aspect of it, that when I was, at the hospital and things like that, where they're like, I was like, I've lost this baby. And they're like, well, we need to be like, sure, we can't say for sure. And it was kind of a whole week process until medically they were like, yeah, you have had a miscarriage. And that's another whole added layer that made things super hard, where, when I finally saw the doctor and they're like, okay, we need to like do this ultrasound or whatever. And they're like, yeah, but you need to go back the next day for us to be sure. And then, okay, your hormone levels are, your pregnancy hormones level are not reducing. So you need to go back in 2 days for a blood test, and so then it's almost like, bringing in, I guess, some of the cultural aspects is like for my family. And like, for example, my mom, when I kind of shared with her I was going to the hospital and stuff, she's like, we're going to start praying, because we're Christians. So we're going to start praying, and I was just like, well, what are you actually praying for? Like, are you praying that I have strength? And I mean, and I mean, I know my mom's going to listen to this because she listens to like everything I'm in. So mom, I'm not like being mean, we've already talked about this, but, for her and for just, I think family, it's kind of like, okay, we're praying for a miracle, right? That like this baby is not lost. But for me, I was just like, I already know, and so that was kind of made things harder, to start, I guess, that grief. And then, anytime like I did the first thing and mom was like, yeah, we're still praying. We're still praying. It could. I'm like, no, it's not going to change anything. And I didn't say anything to her, but that's just, yeah, that was just that whole week of having to do tests and the doctor's not saying, okay, we want to be 100%. And then, there's as well the prayers from where it's like, yes, that's support. That's how that's how we show support, is we're going to pray and do all night prayers and things like that.
Yeah. It sounds like for you that support offering for you wasn't necessarily what you needed in that moment, for on both sides, from the medical and the family side, because it sounds like you already knew that you had lost the baby. And so I know, Rebecca, when you and I chatted, we talked about this because you, obviously people who are listening can't see you, but you're a Black African woman. And we kind of talked about that knowing that you speak of, that you knew that you had lost your son, and having the medical system diminish your knowing and what that kind of meant for you. And so can you tell us a little bit about that experience when you went into the hospital?
I live downtown and there's Sheldon Schumer, but we're like, okay, we're going to go to Foothills. Because I had a midwife and she was like, yeah, go to Foothills. So we went and obviously this is COVID times and their emergency room was pretty packed and very busy and we had to do the screenings and, Vic, that's my husband, at the beginning, they didn't know if you'd be able to sit in the waiting room with me because they were trying to reserve spots for like people that were actually sick, but he got to, sit with me. And I mean, the wait was like so long for me to even see anyone. And then I finally went to get checked in with the nurse and, I'm sitting there and she's just like, so what, why are you here? And I was just like, and I hadn't cried in a bit, and I'd just been holding it together. And then I just like got super overwhelmed and I'm like, I am having a miscarriage. Like I'm losing my baby. And she looked at me and she paused and then she just kept going with just asking questions. And I was just like, visibly, I was like crying, like, so visibly, I was just like, have you no empathy? Like, and I'm a social worker, right? So I'm like, okay, you're in a helping profession, and she was a white nurse or whatever. But in that moment, I'm like thinking, I was like, okay, I know one, yes, she's a frontline, she's a nurse, like this is COVID times, like the wait room is super busy. I don't know how long she's been on shift. So I was like, okay, maybe that's why she's just not like seeing me basically. I was like, you're a woman. Like I'm crying. I'm sobbing. I just told you I'm like actively having a miscarriage. So I was like, okay, maybe it's that. But then another layer was also like, okay, like maybe it's because I'm Black, right? Like which could it be? Or it's a combination of both or something. But I was just like, at the end of the day, I was just like, this is fucked. Like, this is so cold, and where I'm like, as a social worker and, when I'm doing intakes or whatever, I need information for my clients. But if they share something traumatic, I stop to acknowledge that, even to just say, I'm sorry, and that really just made, I'd been waiting for hours and I wouldn't even be able to see a doctor right away. And that just like gutted me, And then she was just like, oh, do you need a pad? And I went into the bathroom and I'm just like crying and I go out and they were like, oh, Vic, he has to leave and stay outside because it was getting full and it's cold in there. And I'm just like, no one freaking cares, and I'm still cramping and stuff. And then, I end up texting Vic. I think by now it was like maybe 1 a.m. And I was like, Vic, I can't because I started, spotting around like 5. But I was like, Vic, I can't stay here. This is just like messing with me. I can't, like, I'm going to lose it. We have to leave. Like, let's just maybe try and go to Sheldon Schumer. And as we're kind of walking up to check out and stuff, because maybe 15 minutes earlier, there was this man that had been waiting and he was just frustrated. And he's like, you know what, I'm going to leave and stuff like that. And he left. But they make you sign this thing saying you left on your own will. But we're walking up and there's the guy who is at the front that initially does the COVID screening. And he's like, here comes another one, ha ha ha, And I mean, like, obviously he doesn't know my story. He doesn't know whatever. And I get, where I was just like, should we be joking that people are like sick and they've been waiting and they just want to go, like, so it was just another thing. And I just really walked out of there just being like, this is shitty. Like, why am I going through this? And I just wanted to go home. I didn't want to like do anything medical. But, where my midwife was like, yeah, we need to just, you need to get seen and stuff. So we went back to Sheldon Schumer. Thankfully, the wait wasn't long and their staff there was just amazing. I was like, I should have just gone there. And, the male, it was a male nurse who did my thing. He's like, how's your pain? Like, how are you feeling? And he's like, I'm sorry, and he gave me some Tylenol and stuff. And I was like, I felt cared for. And then when I had gone to the window for the ladies and stuff, when I said, I'm actively having a miscarriage, she was like, I'm so sorry. And then she kept going, and for me, that was enough. Like, I didn't need people to like try and be like, oh my goodness, like this is the worst. Like, I don't know you, right? So we don't need to get personal, but just to say I'm sorry and have me feel seen, but again, then when I finally saw the doctor again, just being able to say at that time, like, I was like, yeah, my baby's lost, but having the doctors then kind of say, well, we need to be 100% sure. That's second guessing of yourself. And I think of, just when you look at some of the stats of experiences of Black women in the States, and I'm sure in Canada, those would be similar numbers, even though they don't kind of collect race-based data, in terms of being able to advocate for yourself in the hospital and be heard and say, well, this is how I'm feeling. I know you're saying this, but this is what it is. Where I don't know. I don't know. I wish now looking back, I could have just told the doctor, I was like, do I really have to like do these things? Like, is it super necessary? Because they didn't have the full ultrasound there at Sheldon. So that's why I had to go to a lab the next day at 1 o'clock, do the full ultrasound. And when I was there, I can't tell you anything about what I'm seeing. You have to get that from the doctor. And I was super pissed about that. I was like, why not? It's my body. It's my baby. It's what is happening to me, and it's kind of giving, I guess, that power back to the doctors. So she was just like, yeah, I can't like, and she's just, I don't know, whatever she was searching for. But I'm like, I know there's also nothing there. Like, baby, what? The baby's secretly hiding somewhere in some little corner or whatever. But again, that, I don't know. I wish I could have just been like, I don't want to do that. Like, do I have to? and being like, I don't know, not knowing if you have a choice where you just have to go with what the doctor is saying. That I feel that if I would have been able to just lose my baby at home and where they're like, okay, just monitor your bleeding. If your bleeding gets to this, then you need to go to the emergency room. But otherwise, because I don't feel like I benefited anything by going through that. So if anything, it's now this stain where I'm like, I can't go to Foothills. I hope none of my friends or family gets sick and they go to Foothills, because now I can't. Like, that's just something that now was an additional form of trauma for me and things like that. So yeah.
So many things that you've said have resonated so much for me. And I think some of our listeners who maybe are not people of color, and have never kind of experienced it. You said at the very beginning, you were questioning, like, is this person being so unempathetic because, it's COVID and they're busy and they're tired, or is it because I'm Black, right? And I think if you are not a person of color, you would never ever think, and that's what privilege is, right? Is going into a space and automatically assuming the care that you're getting is not empathetic because the person is tired, not because of your race, right? And so the fact that you said, is it because I'm Black, I think is really, really valid and really, really important to say, because birthing individuals who experience loss, we are diminished in the medical system as a whole. If you are a person of color, you are questioned. You are questioned, and you are such an advocate, Rebecca, like you and me, this is what we do. You've been such an advocate for so many things the whole time I've known you. And yet in that moment, you were like silenced, right? That is literally, for me, the definition of what systemic racism looks like. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important that we have these conversations, because I think people don't talk about, I know people don't talk about it. And then it continues. And then we walk away from those experiences carrying this additional trauma. You're already, having this grief experience of losing Malachi. And now you have this other additional trauma. Like you said, now you can't even go back to that same facility. And for those who are listening, the second facility that you went to is an inner city facility. So that's probably why you received that care, because the let's be real, the Sheldon Schumer, the inner city facilities, they are serving marginalized populations a lot more than the outskirt facilities.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, when you say the advocacy piece, I was like, even definitely, I am self-aware of the privilege, that I have, right? But where I'm like, even to say we're leaving Foothills and we're going to go to Sheldon Schumer, and that might not have been an option for someone else, or another, African woman maybe who, has an accent or things like that, maybe should have just stayed. I was like, I don't know when I would have seen a doctor, right? Like, who knows? Or if someone was bleeding even heavier, right? Like, cause when I went in, they wouldn't know how. I can't speak to someone to say, okay, this is, how much I'm bleeding and stuff. I could have, I don't know, fainted, passed out, who knows, right? But being able to even say, I can walk away. I don't have to put up with this, that for someone else, they may not have the voice or that agency to kind of say that. But again, despite my education and stuff, where I still felt like, wow, I should just kind of go with what the doctor is recommending and have myself go through these like tests or whatever to prove something that I already like knew. And I think on Thursday, like when, they were like, we don't see signs that there's still a pregnancy or viable pregnancy or whatever. And they're using this language too, right? It's the language that they kind of like are using, and I guess they have to, or I don't know, but I'm like, it's a baby. But where they're like, okay, your whole pregnancy hormone levels are still up. They're not going down or whatever. And there was a little bit of me that was just like on Thursday, I was like, maybe it's not really, which was fucked up. I was like, this is fucking with my emotions. Like, that it could be, maybe I'll go for this blood test and this baby is still like not really gone. But again, in the heart of me, I knew. And again, that's a whole thing, a whole layer in itself.
Yeah. And I remember when you and I spoke about it, that's the thing, right? Is that what systemic racism actually does, and you know this, like you probably see this a lot in your social work in child welfare, is that women of color, Black, Indigenous women of color, are made to feel like we cannot trust ourselves as mothers. We can't trust ourselves as mothers. So that's what, like, you were like, oh, well, maybe this, you said right at the beginning, I knew that I was having a miscarriage. I knew that the baby was gone. No prayers were going to save this baby. You knew that. And yet that self-doubt that the system kind of places on us is like, well, do you really know? Do you really know your body? Do you really know your children? Right. I experienced that so much in my loss journey and in my parenting of my living child. It's this constant, like, do Black, Indigenous women of color actually know how to parent?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think even when you look at Instagram, right? Like, I think social media and what is the ideal motherhood, the white mother is the ideal. And I think even when I was looking up miscarriage stuff, it is predominantly white women sharing about miscarriages. So even when you're kind of trying to find, I don't know, someone who looks like you, maybe has gone through you don't see that as much. You don't see those stories, where people look like you or maybe have similar backgrounds in terms of how you're going to grieve and process things. And that idea of, who's the ideal mother and parent, and who is seen as an expert as well too in making like proper parenting, decisions. It's never, it's not us, right? It's not people who look like us.
Agreed,
which is another layer.
Which is why I was so honored that you wanted to come on and speak about this with us.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to my sister, right? Because I was kind of like contemplating if I would ever share and how I would share it. And I think sometimes where I think another thing is as a Black woman, and I think as racialized individuals, we don't want to feel like we're speaking for our entire community, where because there's not as, you don't see, African women or Black women sharing about miscarriages, that now I'm like, okay, I'm this like, I don't know, African miscarriage expert, or, I'm this person and I'm speaking for everyone's experience, because they're, like everyone's like, we have the similarities that we're Black or we're African and Christian and all this stuff, but I don't speak for everyone from my community. And I think sometimes that's this burden that we sometimes feel like we have to take on, that I think that, for white women who go through loss, they don't have that burden, because when it is more normalized, it's more out there. So you kind of feel this duty where I was like, should I speak up? Should I share? Because maybe is another Black woman going to see my story and say like, I'm okay and I'm healing and stuff. But I also need to be authentic and do it for me. Like, I shouldn't feel, where my sister was like, I shouldn't feel like I have to share my story because, right, it has to be true to me. And, it's also interesting that when I was talking to my mom, she was just like, I don't really know, because my she's going to be 57, 58 this year. But, she was just like, she's like, I don't really know people that had miscarriages back home, but then I was just kind of thinking where I was like, what if it's that people just didn't share at all? Right. So then you're going to be like, oh, I never knew anyone that had a miscarriage, or that wasn't really an issue. But how many, just with some of the cultural, religious, traditional aspects that, women are experiencing loss and silence. They don't say, anything. And I even think of like my sister-in-law, they live in Sierra Leone, and she has 2 boys And then she was pregnant and lost the baby with 20 weeks. And it was just kind of like, it wasn't a big deal. Like like the attention on miscarriage, it just was not like seen as a big deal. Like, okay, she lost the baby and she was okay. Like she survived, she was okay. And then it's like everyone moved on and it's not a thing, and Vic's sister, I'm close to her. She had a loss. She has 3 kids, but it's not something that is like seen as this is my story and I need to share. It's just part of life and you just move on, which is also interesting, right? Where I'm like, are we weak out here? But it's like, I don't know, but it's just interesting. Kind of like, I don't know. I just thought that was like super interesting, and I mean, I think of my grandma. My grandma had 8 kids, and just back to back. And I just wonder, I was like, I wonder if she, had a loss because it's just the idea that culturally, like, you have to be a mom and it's something that's just seen as natural. So if people are experiencing loss, they don't say anything or they're just accepted and they're like, I'll just have another at some point. Who has time to listen to me, share about losing a baby? Especially maybe if you already have one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Totally. And I think some of that too, like you said, are we just weak here? Is it that, or it's this notion, and you've actually said this to me many times, is this notion of Black women needing to be strong in particular, right? So is it that we're weak here, or is it that over there's just no other option but to quote unquote be strong?
Yeah. Yes. I know I say that jokingly, but yes, there's no.
But that really resonates with me when you say that, because it's this belief system that I think we have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and people will say to me, that's the thing too, right? I'm trying to remember, but people will be like, you're so strong, you'll be fine. Like, kind of like those, like, cause I mean, I have that persona, right? I don't know, but like people are just like, you're so strong, Bex, like, you'll get through this, you'd be fine. And I don't know how it went, but I didn't I didn't go like bad shit or whatever. I didn't just like stay in bed the whole time. I don't know. And I think I was talking to a friend who had a loss similar to mine, where she had a baby, a son, and then it was her second time trying. Where I was just like, should I be like more out of it? Like, how should I was just kind of like being like, should I be crying more? Should I be more like whatever? And where people just like were sending me messages and I actually, my sister, like because I told people and family, I could not deal with talking to people. And so what I did is I told my sister to be my spokesperson. She's my communications manager. She's the best, but she basically dealt with all family and friends because, again, in our culture and stuff, when something happens, tragic happens, it's like you go to that person and you want to offer that comfort, which is beautiful and it's amazing, right? Like we need to be there, but it can also be very overwhelming when you're still just process. Like I was just like, I just lost. I don't even know how I'm feeling. And where people like, how are you doing? Or they want to ask the same questions and I'm going to have to repeat myself like times. And so she just kind of handled that for me. And it was like, almost a week and a half. It was like the most amazing thing not to have to deal with that emotionally. But again, the text messages that were coming in from people and the voicemails, they're like, you're so strong, you'll be okay, and all this stuff. And I was just like, that pressure. I know they weren't trying to, but you have that pressure to be like, I need to be strong. And that if I was like losing it and Vic was like, she's not getting out of bed and she's like, what would people be saying? What would people be saying? Like, would people, so it's again, I think that pressure. I mean, I know obviously people say that to all women, but I think that as you're right, that sometimes I think culturally we're just expected to be able to deal with it, or you pray through it and God got you. And they're like, well, you have tonight. Like I think so we're like, you've had one child, and even the doctors say it, you've had one child and your body knows what it's doing. So it's fine. again, to kind of diminish, like, you'll be able to try again and, your body. But it's almost like, well, let me sit with this loss of this baby. Yeah.
Everything that you're saying is just so, just on point. And I want to go back to you saying, you're not speaking for an entire community. This is your experience. And I think that's really important because it's true. Sometimes racialized folks, we feel like then we are speaking for a community, and that leads to us silencing ourselves sometimes even more because we shouldn't have that. That shouldn't be what it is, right? We are speaking of our experience, and that's like this whole podcast. That's what the point of this podcast is it's real talk about people's experiences. And we want to elevate and share people's experiences and the voices of people that are not, that these stories are not being on the mainstream platforms, right? Like you said, right? Even the pregnancy loss, it's all, well, we know this for certain. It's usually white women who are there and sharing their stories. We've heard those stories many times, not to diminish their stories because their stories are important, but our racialized folks' stories are also equally as important. And so I just thank you so much for coming on, especially today. Like, what a beautiful way of like celebrating, honoring, and remembering Malachi and speaking about it and him for the first time publicly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such a beautiful, and I think Danyelle and I just feel so very honored that you chose this space and this platform to share that story.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I was like really important how I did it, and I feel very comfortable with you given our relationship in the past, and gotten to know Danyelle through the board, and the work that you guys are doing is really important and amazing. And I do love that you guys are wanting to amplify those voices that are normally not, talked about in these spaces, and still being able to support the center in some way. I remember I took part in that training, peer support training. And I was just like, I've never experienced loss, but I know grief. And then now a year later, and I started, you guys are on my monthly donation, contributions, that I started doing, last year and everything. So, I really strongly believe in the work that you guys are doing. And it's been great to see how much the center has grown in the last year.
It's been crazy.
And that's exciting. But I wouldn't been able to. I think I was ready to kind of share my story, but I wanted to do it in a very intentional way. So I appreciate you guys creating that space to do that.
Thank you. Danyelle, do you want to ask Rebecca our kind of our closing question?
I would love to ask. And I just want to thank you again for sharing, Rebecca. Although I'm not a racialized person, listening to your story, there are pieces I relate, and then every time I think, oh, I relate to this, I don't relate. So just thank you, because hearing your story, and even when you share your hospital experience, I'm like, yeah, you're right. I don't think that when the person's being grumpy, that they're grumpy with me. And I mean, I have had to access emergency a number of times because of my own chronic illness, and never do I ever think, oh, well, they're not going to pay attention to me. Sometimes they don't because they think migraines are not important, and that's another story for another day. But I never have to worry about the color of my skin or my accent or anything ever affecting my care. So I just want to thank you for bringing that, because that's an experience that our community, lost community, and just even racialized individuals in other situations are experiencing. And they shouldn't be. So just thank you, because it's something that I kind of was aware of, but I've never really had to think about it in relation to my own life and what privilege I have. So anyways, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And if I can just say one thing about that, Danyelle, it's true, because I think Rebecca and I, when we spoke earlier about, the idea of doing this podcast, and she said, was it because they had a bad day, or was it my race? Racialized folks, we fear saying that out loud, because then people are like, why do you make everything about race? Right? So it's just like it's like the kind of this vicious cycle. So I really appreciate Danyelle,
Yeah.
you know how much I appreciate you and being an ally. And I appreciate that. And that's what I'm hoping that people will take away from this is every story, every lost story, every baby lost is important and needs to be heard, needs to be validated. And we need to be able to talk about the uncomfortable truths in this journey. So thank you. Now you can ask the question. Sorry, I wanted to say that.
No, thank you. So Rebecca, if you could go back and give yourself or somebody in your place a piece of advice, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I would speak up more for myself and, with the hospital process. Like I think, just from the beginning with my midwife, I think I would have kind of said like, do I really have to go to the hospital now? This is kind of my state. What are my other options? And, then again with the doctor and things like that not to take away from medical professionals, but I think that as women, we need to, really trust ourselves and our experience and be able to say, I think this is what's going to be best for my healing. Because I think that if I had been able to be at home, then that would have changed where I was comfortable or, I wasn't able to like take a shower until like I was up the whole night and all these things that, just being comfortable, being able to watch a Netflix and have my husband hold me or even stay with my daughter because my daughter went to be with my sister. So being able to say, you know what, I think this is I know this is what I need right now as I'm going through this very traumatic experience and being able to voice that and ask for options. I think there's always options and being able to voice that. That's what I would have done differently. And to say to people, don't be afraid. They're doctors, but they're not gods. And with any professional, I'm a social worker, but I try my best to approach my work with humbleness. With clients, I say, I just have this degree, that I was privileged to be able to afford to get, but I'm not an expert on your life. You're the expert. And I'm looking to you to guide me. And that means a lot for my parents, for the parents that I work with as they're going up against this child welfare legal system. So I was like, I wish I did that for myself in that moment. But yeah, I think that's what I would say back to myself and to anyone else for women kind of going through the healthcare system. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I think people that are listening, you may not have been able to offer yourself that in the moment, but I think for people listening, hopefully they take something from your story and be able to offer that either for themselves or for others that are coming behind them. So I really, really thank you for that. And that's why, the mission at our center is to make sure that we are providing those options for people's healing, right? We don't offer one type of support. We're offering many different pathways to healing because not everyone heals in the same way. And that's what we're trying to do. So what we strive to do is to empower people to find the healing that resonates for them. So I think that's a beautiful message, Rebecca.
Thank you.
We will be holding you and Malachi close in our hearts today and always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Loss, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Goodbye.